welcome to Full Throttle RC presented by Warehouse Hobbies. I'm your host, Tony Castronovo. This is our second season of doing this show, and last year we had fantastic reviews, so we look forward to 2009 Full Throttle. But before we start this year, I want to take a few minutes to reflect on somebody that we lost very important in our industry a couple months ago, and that's Chris Canelli. Chris, as most of you may know, was the host of Radio Control Hobbies DIY network, and he did so for several years. And Chris was a heck of an asset to our industry. I knew Chris for 30 years. Matter of fact, the first person I ever met when I got into this industry, and he was a hell of a character. And if you didn't have the chance to know him in person, he was unbelievable. I mean, what you saw on his TV show was just a small portion of him, and it was genuine and real. And I want to take time to reflect on the memories of Chris. And if it wasn't for Chris, I would never have been prompted to do this. About 5 years ago, he gave me the opportunity to be co-host on one of his shows. And he had called me and says, "Hey, Tony, how would you like to do an episode with me on model boating?" He says, "You know, I don't know too much about model boating, and I'd like to have you on the show." And obviously I said, "Chris, absolutely, man, we'll have a blast." And we never got a chance to really work with each other. We were both musicians. He in New York in a named band in the 80s, and I in Florida. So a lot of the people in the industry used to say back in the 80s, "Hey, if you and Chris ever got together playing music," and I said, "No, we're on two different sides of the country, and we do our own thing." But at the end, I did get a chance to work with this guy, and it might not have been standing next to him with a guitar, but it was fantastic working with him on the show. He was super genuine to the cause, and Chris was just a great humanitarian. A lot of charity functions that he would do, things that most people never even knew. If there was a charity, Chris would be involved with it, especially children. He loved the Big Brothers and Big Sisters organization. And again, we did a couple of shows. He asked me to do a show with him on that, for instance, as a charity event back a few years ago. So I got the chance to work with him about 5 or 6 episodes, and it was a fantastic experience, and I learned a lot. And this show is dedicated to my good friend, Chris Canelli. Okay, on today's show, we're going to talk about the water pump. And when I mean water pump, I'm talking about the small pumps that you'll find common in a lot of the ready-to-run boats, especially the Enforcer line, responsible for circulating water around through the water system of the engine, around the head, through the exhaust system as required, generally used on boats with clutches. Because a boat engine has a clutch, or if your boat engine has a clutch, it is mandatory to use a water pump. And this is because, obviously, the engine is now able to stop and idle. And if it can do that, and it cannot get water pressure through the system to circulate the water, you'll have an overheating issue. So water pumps are mandatory if you have a clutch. If you do not have a clutch, obviously you have to keep the boat up on plane, so the water pressure is going to keep the system full of water, and it's going to work fine. The water pump that we refer to most commonly is manufactured by Walbro and actually started life as a gas pump. And in the early 80s, I was looking for different avenues to make a pump system when I started putting clutches in gas model boats, and that was pretty much in the first days. And we used a couple things on the market that existed in the hobby industry, vibrating gas pumps, and they didn't work that well. So I came across an idea to use a fuel pump for, I believe, an outboard marine engine is what this was used for, and also larger lawn equipment at the time. And it works with vacuum pulse off an engine, just like the two-stroke. And what it does is it takes the pulse from the engine, or the motion of the piston up and down, which creates the crankcase pulse, and it brings it into this fitting in the carburetor and makes the diaphragm work and makes the water pump work. Today, right now you're looking at an RMB pump, which is remarkably similar to a water pump. This is something we manufacture. We started making this about 3 or 4 years ago, and we made a little bit of changes to it. We specifically made it for the use of model boating. We've used heavier diaphragms in it to make it more not as susceptible to damage by alcohol and the gasoline. So the new RMB pump is a fantastic piece and identical in design to the Walbro pump that we've all been using for many years. So as I go through this rebuild section and segment and show you how it works. Both will be the same. Before getting into the internals of the pump, let's talk about how it works a little bit more in detail. There's 3 fittings on this pump, and one is the pulse, one is the water in, and one is the water out. Now, a lot of guys call and ask, how do I know which one's which? Well, on ours, we indicate on the top of the pump by directional flow of arrow, and also we say in and water out. And again, very similar to the Walbro, and I believe Walbro even has arrows indicating this. But the best way to tell, especially the pulse, is this. The top of the pump is the top of the pump that has the heads of the screws. And in some cases, you'll find Phillips. We use Phillips screws, or you might find cap screws. That indicates the top of the pump. So if you were to turn that upside down, opposite end of the screw heads, that would be considered the bottom of the pump. Okay, remember this. On the bottom of the pump, that is the pulse tap fitting. So this is the particular fitting that's going to attach to the crankcase of the engine for the pulse pressure, or also the manifold if they're robbing the pulse pressure from that area. Okay, on the top side again, you'll have indications showing the water direction in. And in this case, you follow the arrow in and you follow the arrow out. And that's the best way to determine what fittings are to be hooked up on the pump. Now, these pumps, being that they're vacuum operated and they have no real moving parts inside that are susceptible to positioning, the pump can be mounted in any direction. It can be right side up, sideways, upside down. It can be wrapped in a piece of foam and just placed off to the right side of the carburetor. Okay, and it still works fine. All right, a few things that we want to talk about before we get into the internals again. We want to talk about how we hook these pumps up, and it's quite important. Okay, remember let's go to the pulse first. Remember we talked about the pulse and what makes this pump work. Well, the pulse is actually what I said. The pulse is a negative and positive suck and push pressure in this fitting. And as you push air into this fitting, it makes the diaphragm rise. As you pull air out, it makes the diaphragm contract. Now, by doing this very fast with a series of 2 valves inside of it, it allows water in and out. It works very similar to the way the human heart works. The heart works very similar. Okay, with that being said, it's very important because pulse is something we're going to be taking from the engine. And pulse is very important for a 2-cycle engine. That vacuum, that negative and positive vacuum inside of a crankcase is vital to the performance of how these engines run. Remember, we talked about in the engine segments last year, we talked about how the fuel blows up through the transfer ports and what positively charges the crankcase, and that's this particular pulse. So if you look at this, how this works, if you were to give more volume in the case or add more volume to the case, you would lessen the pulse required to make the engine run, and that very well can happen. So what's really important is when you hook up this pulse line, you keep it as close to that block as possible. And generally, the rule of thumb that I've been telling for years is no more than 5 inches above the tubing from the block pulse to the pulse of the carburetor. We cannot afford to lose that much engine crankcase pressure, and that's what would happen. Another thing is tubing. A lot of you guys are insisting on using silicone tubing, and I'm really against that in the water system. First off, not so much on water coming in, but when the water's exiting the engine, it's exiting pretty hot, over a couple hundred degrees. Your engine's running 180, 200 degrees. The water on the exhaust side could be, very close to making steam. So silicone and high temperature don't mix together. And worse off is if you're using silicone between the engine case and the pulse, because silicone is a very pliable material. And what happens with the pulse? The silicone, in essence, can become the diaphragm, and it can contract as it pulls and pulses. So now you're losing some of that force necessary to make the water pump work. So that's a really good rule of thumb to follow. So what I recommend is we use, and we have used for years, a real heavy 5/32 neoprene line. And also, neoprene is the only thing that's going to be safe to gasoline. If you run silicone from the crankcase to the pump, there's a certain amount of gasoline that doesn't burn that's going to get into that silicone tube, and it's going to cause an effect on the silicone tube because silicone and gasoline do not mix. So it's really, really important that you use the right stuff. And this thick wall neoprene for the water is perfect, especially on the pulse side and also the hot water section, which is coming out of the cylinder head. Let's quickly take a look at plumbing the system properly. And we talked about water in and out. On your engines, generally, most of the guys, even the aftermarket head guys, are aware of the fact that your low nipple end should be where the water comes in. Heat rises. And also, we want to keep the head full of water as much as possible. It makes no sense to put a fitting in a place on the water jacket to where it would leave a void or an air pocket without water. Obviously, that part of the engine would get excessively hot. So, properly done, and obviously here's Zenoa, and that's properly done. The configuration for the fittings on the head would be low on in and high on out. And also, if you look at the positioning, this is set up at about 4 o'clock. So anywhere between 6 and 4 is fine. And again, this is about 10 o'clock on the outside, and that's fine. The engine generally has a small downward angle, maybe 20, 25 degrees. So we know that water jacket's going to be full of water before the water gets out. So what we're going to do now is basically go over it really quickly. We take our pulse line from the pump. We have a short tube, no more than 5 inches, and we're going to take that line and we're going to plug it into the pulse fitting, the tap fitting on the engine. Now in Forcer, what we do is I don't personally like tapping crankcases, and the reason being is because the crankcase is full of fuel, gasoline, and oil, and the lower you tap on the case, the more susceptible you are to pull that into the water pump. And yes, you'll get some in the water pump, and that's the byproduct, and it works fine with it. But I like tapping in the manifold. And the manifold, the section of the manifold, which is also responsible for pumping the carburetor, we simply drill and tap a hole there, and we steal from there. So we're stealing from the cleanest place, the same place that the company engineers it to pump the carburetor. So what you would do is, to hook up the pulse, is you'd hook up your line from this fitting to this fitting. And that would activate your pump as long as the engine's running. Okay, the water out on the pump fitting right here would then go into the lowest one on the head. So and that line, when we start talking about water coming in and water going out, I don't care how long you make those lines. That really doesn't matter. You just keep it neat, keep kinks out of it. It really has no factor. We just want them. You want them kink free, so you can make them a little bit longer and then move them around things so they don't get in the way. So you want to go from water out to the low fitting always, which is water in. Okay, top fitting on the engine is the water out. Okay, now water out, in this case, there's several different possibilities depending on what type of exhaust system you have. If you're running a dry exhaust system, there will be a water-cooled manifold. So you would go from the water out generally to the water-cooled manifold. From the water-cooled manifold, you'd either exit the boat, or if you have a tune pipe with a cooler, an intercooler on it, you can go from that point to the intercooler, and then the cooler out. And the cooler is actually a coupling cooler, guys. I'm referring to as intercooler. It's actually a coupling with 2 O-rings in it, and water rolls between the 2 O-rings and keeps that section cool. So if you have that particular pipe, that's how it's plumbed. If you have a wet system, like the one I designed, the Pro Wet system, you would go from the head to the exhaust manifold, and from the exhaust manifold, it would go into the header, and thus pushing the water through the system, because that works with wet internally in the pipe, and the water would automatically expel through the pipe. So that's the proper way to hook up a water pump. Let me make one more point, because there's a lot of aftermarket water rings being made now outside of Zenoa, and everything I've touched upon is based on using this particular one. Some of the manufacturers are making 2 fittings in, 2 fittings out, 1 fitting in, 2 fittings out, and basically they're going to be the same format. They're going to be 2 lower fittings somewhere at this position here on the ring, and 2 high fittings somewhere at this position here on the ring. Now, generally, what most people are doing is they're bringing one water in, maybe from one rudder into one, another rudder into another one. They're taking the top water out, bringing one into the manifold. They're taking the other one out, bringing one into the cooler, the outer cooler on the pipe, and then from there it goes out of the boat. What I recommend in those situations is contact the manufacturer for their recommendations, because what you don't want to do is create hot spots. I'm not one for splitting rudders up. If I ran a dual rudder system with water pickups in the rudder or dual transom mounts, I'd much rather see you guys, because of the way the pump operates, I'd much rather see you bring both lines from the rudders into the boat, into a T-fitting, from the T-fitting into the pump. From the time you leave the pump, generally one fitting in the head works very well. If you have a head with two out, then you can split the system, maybe one to the manifold, one to the pipe. But here's the most important part, and I say this to everybody that calls me. You need to be very, very concerned with water cooling, especially on a dry pipe system. It does not take long to burn O-rings up in the header or in the outer cooler of the exhaust system. Okay, you need when you're testing a boat for the first time and you get it running and you put it in the water. There's no reason ever to make a few laps with that boat. You need to get that boat out there, make a quick lap, come in, and watch the water system run. Make a quick pass by you, and generally you're putting your water fittings on the left side of the boat somewhere, so when it goes by you, you can see the water, and watch the stream. If you can run that boat by you and you see a couple or a single pronounced stream, 3-4 inches of water spraying out, you're fine. Just because you put that boat in the water and you started it up and the water pump trickled water out doesn't mean the system's going to work well. Because what can happen is the exhaust temperatures can get incredibly high at the manifold section. And if it did get too high and the water flow was, or not enough water or not enough pressure, the water could boil there, and it will boil there because that section runs in the 600 degree range. And if it boiled quick enough and turned into steam, the pressure back towards this system would be greater than the water pressure coming in. And I've seen this many, many times, and that stops the whole system up. I've got a lot of calls. My God, it works great when I put the water pump when I'm in the water. As soon as I run the boat, after a few laps, the water stops coming out. Then when I bring the boat back, I got a steam kettle coming out the side. That's exactly what's happening. So generally, one in and one out works well. Make sure you got clear passages. Make sure there's no kinks. But if you get into a situation where you're buying a water jacket that has multiple fittings, inquire on the proper way that manufacturer intended for it to be used. All right, let's get to rebuilding this water pump. I have one completely taken apart in front of you here, and this is going to show you the components of the pump. You have the bottom section, the midsection, the top of the pump, okay, the 4 screws to put the pump together. Let's start over here. The lower gasket and the 2 diaphragms, and both of these are identical. And then finally, the large bottom gasket right here, or the top gasket, I'm sorry, top gasket. These are the 2 valves. These are very critical in the function of the pump. This is what makes the pump work. And what these 2 valves do is, this is where when I was referring to the heart, is they work very similar to the ventricles in your heart. As the pressure changes in this bottom cavity here, one of these opens and allows water to go in. And as the pressure goes the opposite direction, this closes, the other one opens and lets the water go out. So that's how it works, and we're going to talk about that in a second, how it all goes together. Okay, let's start with the bottom of the pump. Okay, so once you guys taken your pump apart, put all your parts aside, you have your rebuild kit. Generally, what we're going to do in this case, if you guys got the pump to this point, it's a really good idea to get a rebuild kit. They're not very expensive. It contains all these components shown up here, and I think it's all like $12, maybe $11 or $12 for the kit. And I recommend that you do it once a season or once every other season, because after time these diaphragms will tend to dry out a little bit, and if they do dry out, it upsets the function of the pump. Okay, we take the bottom of the pump, okay, and we take the first gasket, and they're directional. Okay, you can look at these gaskets and look at the pump, and you'll see that the gasket has a little point arrow here, a little round place here, and so does the bottom of the pump. Okay, so here's the sequence. We start with the bottom of the pump always. We put the gasket on that fits, which is the one with the large silver dollar hole in it. So it goes gasket. Okay. Remember I told you these 2 diaphragms are the same, so pick either one. Okay, and again, that's directional. Rubber. Okay. Gasket, rubber. Okay, and that pretty much is how the bottom of the pump works. Now let's take the midsection. The midsection is a section that houses the two diaphragm, or not the diaphragm, but the ventricles here. And we call these umbrellas, because when we were making the molds for them, we didn't know what to call them, and they look like umbrellas. So that's what they're called. So anyway, they're actually a rubber-based valve. Take a good look at the midsection of the pump. This is very important. because those two valves, one goes on one side, one goes on the other. And I want you guys to understand, this is very important, that there's a raised section on each portion, each side of this of the midsection. Okay? If you look in this area here, there's a flat section and there's a raised section. If you turn it upside down here, there's a flat section and there's a raised section. Okay, the pump valve must go in the raised section. If you put it in the flat section, you're going to buy a new kit because these are used one time. And I'll explain that right now. Okay, we want to take the valve, we want to push it through the center hole of the raised section part. And from the underside, we're going to take that little nipple on there and we're going to pull it until you hear it pop, snap through. Okay, and that's what it looks like. Now we want to turn the pump upside down, and obviously there leaves one section which hopefully is the raised section. And you want to take the other valve, put it in the hole in the center, turn it upside down, hold it, and pull that little tail there and pop it right through. And that's how you put the valve section together in the midsection of the water pump. All right. Now that you have the midsection prepared, you need to have a little set of needle nose or side cutters like I have here. And these little tails that are put on the umbrella here, these are only there so you can pull them through. Once they're through and in place, simply cut the tails off flush to the inside of the pump. Okay, you can't leave those on there or the pump won't work. Okay, now, putting it together from here. Take the midsection and again, follow the little arrow on one side, round side. Like I said, it's directional. There is actually pins on these pumps, so they will align in the right direction, okay? So now we have gasket rubber, okay? Now we'll need, it goes rubber next, like this, okay? And then finally the last gasket, like this. So it's from bottom up, it's gasket, rubber, rubber, gasket. Okay, now take your top plate, put the top plate on, and your 4 screws. And at this point, just simply tighten them down. Now it's important that these pumps are closed. We don't want to tighten them to the point where we break the plastic, okay guys, but you have to have these pumps closed. You'll notice, some of you guys will notice that in Forester boats, we use two of the screw holes for mounting holes, and they go into the stringers of the boat. We also turn the top we also turn the midsection, I believe, 90 degrees, which is permissible. You could do that. Like I said, there's indicator pins in there. So as long as the pins allow you to rotate that and the pump will go together, it will work. But it's very important you get these tight. Now, if you are using replacing one out of an enforcer, as I stated, we use two of these holes, the pump holes, to mount into the stringers. So it is important that those are also tight, because if you were to leave that pump open or any gaps in it, it won't work because of the diaphragms, and valves must be a closed system. There can't be any air escape or air in. So it's a real simple procedure to rebuild this pump. It takes about 10 minutes, okay? And it's not a bad idea if you had your boat a year or two now to take the pump apart, now that you know how to do it, and inspect it. Make sure there's not crud and stuff in the lower section. Generally, there is no real possible way for any of the oil or gasoline from the crankcase to get anywhere in the mid or upper section, because that is sealed. The only way that it could breach that is if there was physically a tear or a hole in the diaphragm, in the lower diaphragm, and if that was the case, the pump wouldn't work. Okay, so providing you follow all these directions that we went through here, you should have this is as simple as it gets. Okay, and that's how the water pump system works on a gasoline model boat. And again, with a clutch, absolutely. Without a clutch, not as necessary, guys. There's no real reason to it. But if you have the ability to have that boat idling, sitting still, you'll want to put a water pump on your engine to keep that engine and exhaust system in good running order. Thank you for joining me today on Full Throttle. Stay tuned for new shows. We're going to do a bunch of shows in the next couple months to get back on track. We got a little bit off this year, a little bit busy here, so I didn't have the time, and I was traveling quite a bit. But I'll assure you this year I'll get you a bunch of good shows in.
I love to hear from you guys. You guys are giving me excellent advice on what to do these shows on, and please don't feel like you can't get to me. I'm by no means invisible. I have a direct email that it only goes to my eyes, and that's whobbies@strato.net. You can find it on the website, and believe it or not, I answer all of them every day, and I get tons of them. Tell me what you want to hear. I'll basically do some shows based on that. That's the next episode we're going to do is getting your boats ready for this new season. And I'm going to touch on a lot of little subjects, things that we don't really talk too much about. Batteries, maintenance, simple routine, little tricks that make it easier for successful model boating. And that'll be in the next episode coming up real soon. So again, thank you for joining me today. My name is Tony Castronovo. This is Full Throttle RC. See you later.